I'm Faye Yarbrough, and I'm a professor in the School of Humanities, and I'm also an associate dean in the School of Humanities, and I host these Humanities Now conversations. And the goal of the conversations is to demonstrate how the things we do in the humanities can connect to issues or topics or concerns of the present day. And so we've had 3 this semester. I've already started talking to people for next semester, so stay tuned about what the presentations look like for next semester. I already know that Professor Olivia Young in art history will join us for one conversation. And I'm actually hoping to get one of your colleagues, Professor Kim, one of your new colleagues, Professor Liu, to join us next semester. So fingers crossed that he will say yes. But today, our conversation is with Professor Jaymin Kim, who is the TT and WF Chao Assistant Professor of Transnational Asian Studies. Professor Kim is also a Rice alum, receiving his BA here. He then completed his doctoral work at the University of Michigan, and before joining us this year, he taught at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the Korea Military Academy in Seoul, South Korea. Today, he will present A Tale of Two Criminals, Elastic Sovereignty in Asian Borderlands. And if you have questions as he's offering his presentation, feel free to add them to the chat, or you can raise your hand at the end of his presentation and we'll get through as many questions as possible. So without further ado, Professor Kim.
Oh, thank you so much for your invitation, Faye. It's really a great honor to be speaking to this audience and hopefully after it's been recorded and uploaded. Okay, so let me first go ahead and share my slides. Yeah, it's funny how you stopped teaching on Zoom for 2 months and then you suddenly forget everything. Okay, so today I'll be speaking about Chinese imperial jurisdiction over Korean and Vietnamese tributary subjects and elastic sovereignty in early modern Asian borderlands, especially specifically 18th century. So this talk is actually based on research for my current book project, tentatively titled Elastic Sovereignty in Early Modern Asia. In this book project, I'm going to analyze how the Qing Empire and 3 of its tributary states, today's Korea, Vietnam, and Uzbekistan, handle interstate refugees and criminals from the 1630s to the 1840s. In this talk, I'm going to be focusing on 2 criminal cases and comparing them from mid-18th century Chinese borderlands, Kim In-sul case in China-Korea borderland and Hwang Phuc-bae case in China-Vietnam borderland. I'm going to highlight the norms of interstate jurisdiction that these 2 cases had in common. And by doing so, I'm going to show 3 defining characteristics of interstate relations in early modern Asia. First, multiple and shifting conceptions of jurisdiction. Second, an asymmetrical relationship between Qing and tributary states. Third, elastic sovereignty. Now, let me briefly review 3 relevant bodies of scholarship. I would normally spend a lot longer time here, but I understand the talk today, the conversation is geared toward a wider audience. So I'm going to try to be brief. So the first body of scholarship is scholarship on Qing history. Qing is the last dynasty in Chinese history, and until recently, most historians of China have thought of Qing as the last pre-modern or feudal Chinese dynasty. In the 2000s, though, new Qing history scholars like Mark Elliott, Peter Perdue, the works of whom you see on the screen, they began to use newly available sources, especially archival sources in Manchu, to show how Qing was different from its predecessors. And their research has shown Qing to be inner Asian, multicultural, and early modern. But despite all the achievements, New Qing history still largely confines its framework within today's Chinese borders. And I'm going to explain that further with a map of the Qing Empire. So here we see a map of the Qing Empire from 1820. And here we have a red line that separates the core zone of China proper from inner Asian frontiers such as Manchuria, Mongolia, Tibet, and today's Xinjiang. These are the frontiers of the intermediate zone that New Qing history has focused on so far. And the red line here marks today's borders of the PRC, People's Republic of China. So far, New Qing history has really limited its spatial and conceptual framework within this red line. So even though these scholars keep saying that Qing is not China, their framework is still limited by today's national borders. So my project goes beyond that by looking at Qing from the perspectives of its smaller neighbors. So today's Korea, today's Vietnam, and today's Uzbekistan, known as Kokand then. And I call this the tributary zone, which is not a particularly new framework, but I'm going to explain how that ties into the second body of scholarship. The second body of scholarship is scholarship on the Chinese tributary system. More than 50 years ago, the great China historian John Fairbank, he came up with a thesis of Chinese world order. And in that thesis, he emphasized the Sinocentric and hierarchical nature of the tributary system. China came with its hegemony and dominance, and the tributary states like Korea and Vietnam largely accepted those presumptions. And according to Fairbank, Korea and Vietnam were two of the three model tributaries because that's where the theory and practice corresponded most closely to each other. In the past 50 years, many scholars who study Chinese history have criticized this model. Meanwhile, for Korea and Vietnam, the general historiographical trend has been to write autonomous histories of the nation in reaction against colonial historiographies. Korea and Vietnam are both, societies that have been colonized in the past, Korea by Japan, Vietnam by France. So there were these tendencies of colonial historiography that chose to emphasize the lack of internal dynamics, internal driving engine within Korean and Vietnamese societies, and basically showing Korea and Vietnam to be little Chinas that were just not quite good enough and that just could not make it. So very understandably, post-liberation in Korea and Vietnam, the trend has been to emphasize the autonomy, the independence of the Korean nation and the Vietnamese nation. Now, both of these schools share this presumption, this dichotomy of Chinese hegemony versus tributary independence. And now in recent years, we have several new works, representative of which are Kathleen Baldanza and Yuan Cheng Wang, who have decided to look at the praxis of tributary relations. If Korea is a model tributary, if Vietnam is model tributary, how did it actually work? That is a very simple question that we just have not asked until very recently. And now, based on these new works of scholarship and my own research, we can begin to conduct a comparative overview of the Qing tributary system in practice. And that is precisely what I attempt in this book project. So I do this by comparing Korea, Vietnam, and Uzbekistan, and how they handle their relations with Qing China, especially on the issues of refugees and criminals. Lastly, this is a work on law and China, as many scholars of Chinese law have noted. Until recently, there was this notion within legal studies that there was no law in China, traditionally speaking, so there could not be a study of Chinese law. But recently, again, with new available resources and especially legal archives opening up in China, many historians and legal scholars have looked at Chinese law in imperial times. And Matthew Sommer, whose book you see here, his work is really a good example. In recent years, from the other on the other hand, with works by scholars such as Lauren Benton, global legal history as a field is growing as well. But what I see from my perspective as a historian of Qing law from global perspectives is the fact that these two schools, scholarship on Chinese law and scholarship on global legal history are not really, talking to each other. And that is what I attempt to do in my larger book project. Okay, now I'm going to introduce my talk and situate it in my book project. In this talk, I'm going to limit myself to 2 borderlands by comparing a murder case in Manchuria within this red circle in the Qing Korea borderland and a manslaughter case in Guangxi in the Qing Vietnam borderland. Both these cases took place in the mid-18th century. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this time period in Chinese history, the emperor at this time was the Qianlong Emperor. His reign represented the height of Qing imperial expansion, and this historical context led to the rise of this universalist worldview. The Qing court, led by him, more often saw its domain as unbounded than bounded, exponential, ever expanding, and no limits. This emperor ruled his vast domain in a pluralistic way too. He liked to differentiate the borderlands from China proper, and he liked to rule each borderland in a distinct style that suited the local conditions. And I'm going to show a few artworks that kind of illustrate that in a visual way. For example, he adopted the persona of a Confucian son of heaven for his Han Chinese constituency in China proper, the vast majority of his subjects, as pictured here in a painting portrait that is now kept in Cleveland. But to his Manchu and Mongol Inner Asian constituency, he emphasized his position as a martial warrior king in annual hunting trips like the one pictured here, where he is on horseback and shooting a deer. Lastly, here you can see Qianlong depicted as Manjusri, the bodhisattva of wisdom in the Tibetan Buddhist genre of Tanka. This was a way for him to appeal to Tibetan Buddhists in Inner Asia, and that is something that extends way beyond what we think of as Tibet today, because this was another universal religion that is kind of, obscured by the label Tibetan Buddhism. For this larger project, let me talk about my sources real quick. I used Qing archival sources, diplomatic documents, and other published sources. The main body of my sources are Qing archival sources, such as the 1814 Manchu Language Palace Memorial that you see here. Today, these memorials and these sources are largely housed in the archives in Beijing and in Taipei. A lot of these have been published as well, such as this 283-volume Manchu language archival materials from Qing Xinjiang, which is kept at the Asia Library in University of Michigan. And these collections have really made it possible for me to keep working on my book project in this time of pandemic. So I'm very grateful for these published collections. In any case, Qing archival sources, and especially Manchu language sources, they're like the raw texts that were later sanitized into diplomatic documents and other official sources. They've been at the center of my attempt to write a comparative history of Asian borderlands. And by raw, I mean things like this. Every now and then, I'll see a memorial that is in Manchu, and it'll specifically say at the end, do not translate that into Chinese. Or I'll find out some information that I noticed from these archival materials, and then they just conveniently disappear in the diplomatic documents that were more official, which is my second body of sources. So here we see a 1784 collection of documents, diplomatic documents from Korea, Dongmunhuigo. As I mentioned, these are more polished documents, and they omit a lot of information that these governments didn't want to share with their neighbors. So, imagine WikiLeaks and so on. Still, these polished official documents are useful for looking at imperial tributary relations in theory and practice, because they focus on protocols and precedents, how things should happen and how things should have happened, and so on. Last, I also look at Korean and Vietnamese chronicles because they're very useful for highlighting the internal perspectives of the tributary courts. Oftentimes you see within this course, they are very doubtful of Qing Chinese dominance, hegemony, their demands and so on. But these doubts, these criticisms will conveniently disappear in for my current, I use these sources from across Asia to construct a bilateral view of these interstate relations and compare them. In this talk, through the two case studies, I'll show flexible and shifting conceptions of interstate jurisdiction in these borderlands. These conceptions in turn show interstate jurisdiction to be fundamentally asymmetric. Moreover, that asymmetry reveals that both Qing imperial and tributary or sub-imperial sovereignties or elastic. And by elastic, I mean, elastic that you are, imagining in your head, probably. I mean sovereignty that encompass degrees of sovereignty that range from partial to full and beyond full from a modern perspective. A conventional account of sovereignty attributes this modern conception to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which concluded the 30 Years' War and is often considered the source from which the principles of interstate equality and non-interference emerged as the norms of international relations in Europe and later on the rest of the world. Now, I'm going to turn to our first case in the Qing-Korea borderland. So here we see a map of the Qing-Korea borderland and its surrounding regions. So this is Korea, this is Qing. And at this point, I want you to note the short distance between the two capitals of Beijing and Seoul, here shown as Hanyang. In fact, until 1644, the Qing capital was in Mukden here. So the distance between the capitals was even closer. More relevant to this case, it was near the Manchu garrison of Hunchun, just north of the Tumen River, where the murder took place. Let us zoom in a little. This is an 18th century Korean map of the Qing-Korea borderland. Among the three borderlands that I studied, this was the most well delineated borderland. The two states established the Yalu River as their natural frontier in 1637. And then they came to agree on the Tumen River as the natural frontier by the 1680s. Finally, they delineated the Changbai Mountains, known as Baekdusan in Korean, between these two rivers in 1712. So at least on paper, in theory, boundary was pretty well delineated by early modern standards. And with the delineation of the boundary came an interstate attempt to ban what they now were calling trespassing. And just 10 years before, 100 years before, this would not have been considered trespassing because there was no well delineated boundary at that point. And by the 1640s, intentional trespassing by Koreans was punishable by death. And so it became a pretty serious, offense. Even so, with the limited state apparatus, the many economic opportunities provided by ginseng and many other natural resources, and the mountainous geography that you can see from even this map, borderland residents, they just continue to trespass these state boundaries. And we only know about these activities because some of them got caught. But, historians of smuggling, scholars of smugglers, they often say only bad smugglers get caught. And that's how we learn about them. And, we can assume that many others were more successful and they just, completely perish in history. Well, not completely, but they do not leave the paper trail as they have done with this case. Now, our first case, the Kim In-soo case, after the name of the principal offender, it started out as one of these, usual trespassing cases. In December 1749, Kim In-soo and two other Koreans from this town called Yuwon, they crossed the Tumen River to collect firewood. And there they encountered Qing ginseng gatherers that numbered 7. The ginseng gatherers there were pretty short on food, and they suggested exchanging their ginseng for rice. Ginseng was a high price commodity then, even more so than now. But when the Koreans returned next day with their rice, they were driven away without getting the promised ginseng. Now, according to Kim In-sul's testimony, this was a year of famine. And this loss of rice without any compensation made this a matter of life and death. So they went back in their town. The three victims, they recruited four of their friends, and they plotted to rob the Qing ginseng gatherers. On the night of December 24th, they crossed the Tumen River and attacked the tent of the ginseng gatherers, killing 6 but letting 1 escape. This survivor managed to notify Qing authorities before dying from his frostbite, and that notification turned this crime into an interstate criminal case, because now both Qing and Joseon authorities knew about this case, which was, homicide, obviously very serious crime in any legal system. By February, along the vertical route, the Hamgyong provincial authorities reported to King Yeongjo of Korea in Seoul of the murder, as well as the arrest of all the suspects. According to precedents, which were well established by then, Yeongjo then sent out a lateral communication, an official document exchange between equals, to the Qing Ministry of Rights in Beijing. So here we see the Korean king and a Chinese metropolitan office acting as equals. This communication stated the king's desire to wait for the imperial decision, because now these Koreans were no longer his subjects, but the criminals of the emperor. Here I would like to emphasize 2 things. First, Joseon Korea, because of their early interactions with Qing, had regular access to a Qing metropolitan Ministry of Rights, which sounds trivial in our conception today, but this was the most important metropolitan ministry out of 6 that existed. Second, the suspects were no longer considered the Korean king's subjects. Now they were emperor's prisoners. So we kind of see this, change in subjecthood, which we would call something like citizenship today in this context. Then the flow of communication turned vertical again. The Qing Ministry of Rights, they compiled a memorial to the Qianlong Emperor in April 1750. And here I just want to give you an example of 2 Qing Palace memorials, and this is why I call it vertical. Here we see the term memorial, whether in Chinese or in Manchu, elevated 1 spot, the 1 spot above any other line. And any term having to do with the emperor, such as here and here, it is elevated 2 spots. So the very document, the format of the document makes sure that there is hierarchy, there's vertical hierarchy that exists not only within the Qing government, but also within the international order that we see here. The King of Korea, in short, wasn't equal to a Qing metropolitan ministry, but subordinate to the Qing emperor. In its April memorial, the Ministry of Rights, they pointed to 2 precedents. One was for a joint trial to be held in the Qing border city of Fenghuangcheng by Qing and Korean judiciaries. And the other was trial by the Joseon king, which was subject to reviews in Beijing. In the end, Qianlong Emperor, he decided on the first option, the joint trial. Now, this use of precedents was a central feature of Qing Korean interstate jurisdiction. Some of these interstate trials even predated the compilation of Qing legal codes, again, because they had longer history of interaction than any other imperial tributary pairs. And results of these early trials were often used as legal basis in later trials. Now, the institution of joint trial was one of those relics. From 1644 to the end of the 17th century, there were 12 joint trials in the Korean capital of Seoul. In these trials, the Qing officials were sent to Seoul and they would cooperate with the Korean court, with the king in interrogating the suspects and adjudicating on the cases. These Qing envoys were again considered equal to the Korean king. And while they had no jurisdiction over the king, the Qing Ministry of Rights and ultimately the Qing Emperor had jurisdiction over the king and could impose fine of silver against the king. Now, this form of joint trial was gradually replaced by a joint trial that took place in the border city of Fanghuangcheng in 1712. In this new form, 3 mid-ranking Qing officials met with a high-ranking Korean official in this town and then interrogate the suspects there. And that is what happened with this case. The joint trial for Kim Il-soo case followed this routine. We don't know what the joint interrogation looked like, but here's a later picture from late 19th century of a late Qing joint trial in a foreign concession. Scholars like Perry Castle have actually pointed to how these consular jurisdiction had some precedents in legal pluralistic law of the Qing dynasty. But in any case, after the interrogation was concluded, King Yeongjo received the deposition and he adjudicated according to precedents for trespassing homicide cases. All 7 criminals were sentenced to immediate death by beheading, confiscation of properties, and enslavement of family members. This term of adjudication then was reviewed in Beijing, first by the Qing Ministry of Punishments and then by the Qianlong Emperor himself. Both confirmed the king's adjudication. And with the final decision having reached the Joseon court, the executions were carried out in July 1751 on the Tumen River border. And here's what that execution might have looked like based on later paintings from late 19th century. Using this case, I'm going to highlight 2 defining features of the Qing-Korean interstate jurisdiction. First, shared jurisdiction was the norm in this borderland. And that was largely because Joseon and Qing, they shared a common legal heritage. Both Qing and Joseon legal codes were largely based on the main code shown here from the previous Chinese dynasty. So this factor, along with the long history of interaction, generated a growing variety of precedents that were legible to both states that could be invoked by both states in these interstate cases. This led to Rittenization, which ended up becoming a double-edged sword for the Korean court. On the one hand, the earliest cases had resulted in the most undesirable situations for the court, because that's when the Qing was a growing state and most jealous about protecting its boundaries, its people, its resources. On the other hand, the Korean court knew these precedents as well as the Qing court, and they could often use them to their advantage. Second, this jurisdiction also entailed interstate collaboration, whether this was in the form of a joint trial or trial by the Korean king. Both judiciaries had to collaborate over the duration of the trial. Third, but to the next point, this collaboration, though, also points to the second defining feature of the interstate jurisdiction, asymmetry. Here in the upper left, we see the Qing judiciary and how it usually operated. Adjudication by provincial officials was reviewed by the Ministry of Punishments in Beijing, and then the emperor. Below, we see the Joseon judiciary, where provincial officials, their adjudication was reviewed by the Ministry of Punishments in Seoul, and then the king. Of course, you notice the similarity, which again owes to their common legal heritage. During these interstate cases, though, we see this peculiar situation where the 2 judiciaries are intertwined, but in an asymmetrical way, so that the king is now basically acting as a Qing provincial official. His adjudication cannot be confirmed by himself. It has to be reviewed first by the Qing Ministry of Punishments and then the Qing Emperor. So here we have a scenario where a sovereign no longer has the final say over his own subjects, which clearly shows the elasticity of sovereignty here. So this also meant that the Qing emperor was the sovereign who created precedents and enforced them as the new norm. And here I'm not going to go on for long because I realize I'm learning a little bit late. I'm running a little bit later than I intended. In similar cases where Qing subjects were committing crimes in Joseon, the Joseon court did not have jurisdiction over Qing subjects. They merely repatriated them back to China. And considering these factors, my conclusion from this one case study and many other case studies from this borderland would be that both Qing imperial sovereignty and Korean tributary sovereignty were elastic. Now, let's move on to the next case and the next borderland. So we are moving from Manchuria to Guangxi to the Qing-Vietnam borderland. To give you some geographical context, this is a map of Zomia. This is a term coined by Willem van Schandel and popularized by James Scott at Yale. According to the narrower 2002 conception used by Scott, Zomia is the highland region at altitudes above 300 meters, all the way from Qing-Vietnam borderland that we're focusing on here to northeastern India. Scott's interest in this region lies in the fact that it is the largest remaining region of the world outside the reach of the modern nation state. And considering his, like a stance as an anarchist, it is not surprising that this region is very intriguing to him and many other people today. Here, I would just like to highlight the fact that the Qing-Vietnam borderland was part of this Zomia, and as such was much farther outside the reach of state courts than the Qing-Korea borderland was. Zooming in a little bit, this is an 18th century Qing map of a section of the Qing-Vietnam borderland in Guangxi, where our next case took place. So this map shows that there was an idea of linear border, even though it's intermittent. You see the red dots, which are fences, demarcating some of the territorial boundaries. And we also see that there are all these military installations, guard posts and gates that were defending the border. So the fences and gates and guard posts were demarcating the border at the local level. In fact, this earlier map looks really similar to the 1880s map of the same borderland held by Library of Congress today. The linear border is visualized here as well as the fence and walls, but at the same time, these maps show the borderland again to be mountainous frontier with a tenuous state presence. Outside the military installments, there isn't much state presence that you notice, and you can imagine how at the ground level, it was even less noticeable. So in short, from state perspectives, this was a frontier populated by rebels, bandits, and other unsavory elements that just simply do not appear on these maps. Our next case happened in this very setting, where Vietnamese soldiers pursuing bandits accidentally killed Qing soldiers in one of these passes. And here is just like, a detail from the map. It's not the same, gate by any means, but I just wanted to, give you like a visual illustration of how this might have happened. So the Vietnamese soldiers are in stark darkness. They were pursuing Vietnamese bandits, and then they reached the Qing guard post. And in darkness, the Qing guard personnel heard the commotion, went outside, and there was a skirmish, and two of the Qing soldiers died in this confusing skirmish. Now, this incident was reported to Guangxi provincial officials, who then submitted palace memorials to the Qianlong Emperor. This was the vertical route of communication. And then a joint memorial from 3 provincial officials recognized this as an accident, But at the same time, in one secret memorial from the same date, this would be the raw text that was not translated into the diplomatic documents. The Governor General stated, quote, "This is a matter of border post and thus of imperial system. Therefore, it is inappropriate to regard it as an accident." In other words, they knew it was an accident, but decided to treat it as a crime. So that's where this manslaughter case turns into this interstate homicide case. Now, the Governor General Chao, he decided to request that the Vietnamese ruler Lê Hiền Tông arrest and extradite these soldiers responsible for the killing. So he sent a lateral communication to Lê Hiền Tông, since these two were equals in the Qing tributary world, as we saw with the Joseon Korean king and the Qing Ministry of Rights. So here's an example of lateral communications. It's not the same lateral communication that I'm quoting from, but you can see how the Vietnamese king and the governor general are on the same level. But here again, anything that has to do with the emperor or the Qing Empire is 2 spots elevated. In any case, in making the extradition request, Chao cited the precedent set by a case in 1746, fully aware that these two cases were not comparable. In 1746, it was a case of Vietnamese pirates intentionally injuring Qing soldiers and robbing Qing subjects. In contrast, this was a case of accidental killing. So in his reply, which took more than 7 months to arrive from Hanoi to Guangdong Governor Shulu, Lê Hiền Tông, the Vietnamese ruler, appealed that this was not the same situation. He emphasized the accidental nature of the killing, and he also argued that the imperial concept of treating all peoples equally really should apply here. And in restitution, he sent 100 taels of silver as compensation instead of extraditing the culprits, as scholars of Vietnamese law have noted. Even though Vietnamese law depended a lot on Chinese legal tradition, it seems to have had stronger ideas of tort law and restitution, and like something that we might call vaguely private legal realm. In any case, this concept of treating all peoples equally is an interesting phrase, because Qing emperors love to invoke the same principle to show how generous and merciful they were towards these Korean and Vietnamese subjects. But as you can imagine, they did not like it when their tributary rulers used the same concept and stole the thunder, basically. Qianlong was exasperated, and the official in charge of the Qing Borderland gave Lê Hiền Tông an ultimatum. If you do not produce these suspects in 1 month, then you will face serious consequences. What might that have been? We do not know, because the culprits were extradited in December 1748, and the entire extradition process, I will just note, had taken more than a year. This is a lot slower than any case I have seen in the Qing Korea borderland. Now, according to the precedents, once these Vietnamese subjects were extradited, they either went through an expedited judicial process due to security concerns or a regular Qing judicial process. Either way, the Vietnamese judiciary had no role in these trials after the extradition. Here, the suspects, Huang Fuqbei and Li Fuqji, they went through regular process. So the provincial officials of Guangxi and Guangdong, they reached their terms of adjudication. And then the terms were reviewed in Beijing by the ministry and then the emperor. And in the adjudication process, they used the Qing Code as their statutory basis. They sentenced the soldiers to immediate death by beheading, according to a substatute on soldiers acting recklessly. This adjudication, as I mentioned, was confirmed by the Qing Ministry of Punishments. But then, at the imperial level, the Qianlong Emperor reiterated that these two criminals deserved death, but this was accidental, and Lê Hiền Tông had been respectful in extraditing the criminals. So he ended up pardoning the criminals or culprits and then sending them back to Vietnam so that the Vietnamese king, Lê Hien Tông, could punish the criminals on his own. And this is where we lose the trail of these two soldiers. The sources don't tell us what happened to them in Vietnam, but we can probably assume that they were not executed as they would have been had they remained in Qing. Now, so what does this case tell us about Qing Vietnamese interstate jurisdiction? First, it shows that this was an elastic jurisdiction that operated on fluctuating degrees of territorial and personal jurisdiction. So from the Qing insistence on extradition, we can see the territorial principle, but also from the initial Vietnamese refusal to extradite the suspects, we see the personal principle of jurisdiction at work. And we also see here again that there was a definite asymmetry between the Qing and Vietnamese judiciaries. On the one hand, the Qing state perceived the jurisdiction of Vietnam as something that could be given or taken away. On the other hand, it perceived its own jurisdiction as something that was inviolable. Combined together, these two characteristics again show how Qing imperial sovereignty and Vietnamese tributary sovereignty were elastic. Now, I would just like to briefly mention in comparing these cases that actually the comparative study of Korea and Vietnam is a surprisingly new endeavor. This is a picture from October 2018 in our inaugural meeting of the Korea-Vietnam Working Group. And we are set to meet again in the coming January in LA at UCLA. And I would just like to note that my scholarship owes a lot from interdisciplinary conversation with the members of this group. Okay, now let's look at the conclusions. First, of course, things were different in these two borderlands. In fact, things were different in all three borderlands that I studied. But here, let's focus on the borderlands the way we've seen. First, when we look at the differences, we see that norms of interstate jurisdiction were different. With the more routine procedures in the Qing-Korea borderland versus the Qing-Vietnam borderland, which shows a mix of routine and ad hoc decisions by the Qing state. And then it also shows that Qing legal pluralism was at work in these borderlands as well. So interstate law worked differently in different borderlands. But I think what is more important than differences are commonalities. And in emphasizing the commonalities, I'm following Alexander Woodside comparative outlook, which saw Confucian bureaucracy as a common heritage of Korea, Vietnam, and China. And when we look at the cases and other cases that we have looked at, we see that jurisdiction in these borderlands was flexible. Second, the relationship between Qing and its tributaries was almost always asymmetric, which conforms to the findings of the international relations scholar Bradley Womack. And his use of the term is something that I rely on a lot on my study. Third, these two characteristics made both imperial and tributary sovereignty elastic. And we can use terms like quasi, shared, and layered, but I see elastic as the larger, more flexible, more encompassing term that can cover most, if not all, of these situations. Now, what are the larger implications of this research then? First, this work puts global legal history and recent works on Asian law in conversation. And I've already talked about this, in the beginning, so I will not, talk about this too much. Second, this has bearings on the history of early modern empires. In the past 2 decades, we in Qing history and many other fields of history have gone through this imperial turn. But here again, we need to really talk to each other as fields and just try to see what we have learned collectively about these early modern empires from the Ottomans, from the Mughals, from Qing, and French Empire, Russian Empire, and so on and so on. And last but not least, this project has implications for Westphalian sovereignty. These days, even in the field of international relations and European history, we have come to agree that Westphalian sovereignty was not as absolute, as not as long-lasting as we have suspected so far. And now I think this is a good time to look at the early modern world from a multifocal look. And I think this is something that is perhaps of most interest to a lot of people in the audience, where we are living in this world where all nation states are in theory equal, but we all know that it's not the case, and how to wrestle with that, how to interpret that. I think study of early modern Asia and with China at the center, I think that can really show us some implications on how we make sense of the world today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kim. That was wonderful. So this is the point at which we open it up for questions from the audience. You can raise your hand to ask a question, or you can ask it in the chat. I will take the prerogative as the host of asking the first question. I actually have a bunch, but I'm going to limit myself so other people can ask questions too. So one question is easy and small, and then another has to do with your evidence. So that my easy small question is that you talk about the boundary between Qing and Korea, and that there's trespassing by Koreans was punishable by death, right? And I wondered if the reverse was true, if they even recognize that there's trespass possible from people from Qing, and if it's also punishable by death, because that seems like another potential asymmetry or symmetry. And then I'm really fascinated by this idea that there's evidence where things are left out, right? Where you can see. And so I'm curious, if you see patterns in the kinds of information that's in the raw data that you have, but then if there's something similar about what then they don't want to be in the official communication. Yeah, so just those two questions for now. If the law applies in the other way, and if you can tell a little bit more about what you notice is getting left out.
Yeah. Thank you for those wonderful questions. To start off with the the first question. In most cases, no. So the Korean trespassers were punished with death, mainly because the Joseon court recognized this as a category of crime that could really bring some trouble for the state. So they enacted their own laws banning trespassing with any type of activity. The Qing, on the other hand, did not have this like all trespassers are going to die. It was more lenient, if we can say lenient, more lenient forms of punishment, usually penal servitude and so on. But they had their own statutory basis for that. And so we actually see these cases where by 18th century, Korea, the Joseon court is looking at all trespassers as, capital as those, have to be executed. Whereas Qing state is beginning to see, oh, these people just came here. They were just, poor. They are like what we would think of as refugees today. So you don't have to kill them. But the Korean government was like, no, we're going to kill them. So that is a very interesting irony of how things worked out in the end. Now to the second question, the evidence is quite interesting. In my book project, I focus more on the official interstate side of the story because it's a state-centered project, but I do find it fascinating. So to give you a couple of examples, so when the Korean king, the Korean judiciary is trying to get depositions and reaching terms of adjudication, they do not want to see any inconsistency, any evidence that there might be any doubt about the circumstances of the crime. So we see a very liberal use of torture and very liberal use of threat. If you don't, agree to this, we are going to kill your family members, so that in the sanitized version, everything just works out. This happened like this. Whereas from the Qing side, I've seen cases such as, let's build a guard post in this region. And then in the internal documents, we see that, well, actually this guard post is expensive and it's not actually going to, prevent the poachers from what they're doing. But when they presented it to the Korean government, they presented it as like act of grace, because the Korean king was like, we don't want this guard post so close to our border. Can you not do it? And then the Qing side was like, yeah, by the grace of the emperor, we are going to do that, without saying that practical concerns were at play.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, all right. So audience members, would anybody like to ask a question of Professor Kim after this really fascinating talk? I also have to compliment you on how you laid out historiography for us. And I mean, it was I appreciate, for someone who is not at all conversant in your field, that you really laid things out nicely. So thank you so much for making it accessible. But yeah, more questions. Oh, Professor Lewis.
Hi, Dr. Kim. Thank you, by the way. Thank you, Faye, for organizing this. And thank you, Dr. Kim, for very informative, and enlightening presentation of the research. And I'm going to be one of those people who's going to ask, how does this relate to contemporary policy? Recognizing that it may bear almost no relevance to contemporary policy, but I'm just fascinated by these different notions of what is a criminal, what is a fugitive, and all of these things. And it makes me wonder, especially in East Asia and between China and its former border states, or however we're going to refer to them, is there any, has all of these notions that you're talking about in the past, how does that translate into things like extradition treaties today? Is there anything unique about that? I understand in Southeast Asia, for example, that there's something, but Indonesia and Malaysia have long-standing kind of historic notions of what is technically a pirate with all of their neighbors, and that is actually quite different from so-called international law. And so I'm curious that if is there anything like that going on in extradition issues?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. Thank you so much for the question. And I will just make two broad observations that hint to some relevance. First is connected to Faye's first question. I think one thing that we should remember is that today we think of borderline as like one thing, but even in the cases where the borders or borderlands were well delineated in early modern setting, I think we should look at border in two ways. There is border that is coming from outside to inside China. There is border that is coming from inside to outside China. And like the two flows of traffic are not equal. Things going into China, things going outside China, they're not going to be of the same importance. Second, one thing that I have wondered about, especially with fishing boats in Chinese fishing boats in Southeast Asia, in the waters of Korea, one thing that I find very interesting is that even though Korea never took up on this offer, the Yongzheng Emperor, he actually issued this edict saying that these fishermen, these sailors who are there, they are bandits, they're pirates, they're not Qing subjects, they're not subjects of us. So you should feel free to arrest them, pursue them, and kill them if you'd like. Now the Joseon state, for whatever reason, probably because it feared complications, never took up on the offer. But it is very interesting contrast to the attitude of contemporary Chinese state, where illegal or not, criminal or not, they are, Chinese citizens, and as such should be, extradited and so on, instead of being, harmed in the process. So, it's just very interesting contrast, and I think, in a way, I think it does show something about the first half of the Qing dynasty, where the empire is expanding, and it is very self-confident, and it can afford to do these things, whereas that is not so much the case in 19th century, for example.
Thank you. Very interesting. And I actually imagine it has something as well. This affects. Aren't there constant, fishing boat issues between North Korea, South Korea, and China?
Right.
Yeah. And so I wonder if it relates to that as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah. They really wanted their sea cucumber too. So yeah, you read about that a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we can sneak in one more question before our hours is up. Would anybody else like to ask a question? I also have one in my back pocket, but I want to leave it open to other people. Okay, I take this as a permission for me to be as curious as I want to be. Again, I really appreciate this talk because I feel like I've learned so much, and for all of these sessions. So, okay, to go back to your evidence, this idea of those of the way that you showed how that anything having to do with the emperor. So one of the first ones you showed had smaller script that was kind of down low and off to the side. And so I wondered if that also has meaning. So you were showing how the things having to do with the emperor had meaning and it was raised above. But I think the first one of those documents where you made that point, there was smaller script crowded on the side. And so I just wondered if that extended further in terms of visual representations of hierarchy in your documents, if then something that's crowded and smaller indicates something about lesser importance, or are there other ways that again that visually hierarchy is represented in your sources?
Right, that's a great question. Of course, sometimes it's just a matter of space, but yes, you're exactly right. The small characters, I can't remember which of the images it would be, but most likely it's going to be one of the two cases. It could be the Chinese character Chan, which means your subject, your minister. So Qing officials, Korean king, Vietnamese king, they would refer to themselves as that when they are, writing to the Qing emperor. And interestingly, for Manchu officials writing in Manchu, they preferred, or even in Chinese, they preferred the term slave, because there was this notion going back to their tribal tradition that the Khan owned, the Khan had the sovereignty over all fighting men.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's 1 o'clock. I don't want to keep you. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Professor Kim, for such a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I've learned a lot today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Great to see you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Goodbye, everyone.